"Where's the sniper?" The young soldier shouted into the radio, his voice tight with urgency. For a brief moment, only static answered him. Then a calm female voice came through the speaker. "Already firing." More than a mile away, Chief Petty Officer Abigail Foster lay motionless on a rocky ridgeline overlooking the valley below. The afternoon sun hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Dust drifted through the air with every gust of wind, and the silence around her was so complete that it almost felt unreal. Her gloved hand rested against the stock of her rifle, while her eyes remained fixed on the landscape stretching out before her. There was no panic in her expression, no sign of hurry, just focus. The kind of focus that came from years of training, discipline, and experience that very few people could understand. 24 hours earlier, nobody at Forward Operating Base Griffin had looked at Abigail Foster and seen a professional sniper. They saw a woman carrying a rifle case across the motor pool. They saw someone barely 5'6", with blonde hair tucked beneath a patrol cap and a quiet demeanor that made her easy to overlook. They saw someone who didn't fit their idea of what a battlefield legend should look like. The first comment came from a young infantryman unloading equipment from a transport truck. "That's the sniper they sent," he asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Several soldiers turned to look. Abigail kept walking. "Maybe the real sniper's still on the helicopter," another joked. A few laughs followed. "Careful," a third soldier added. "She might write us a strongly worded email." More laughter echoed across the staging area. Abigail never slowed her pace. She continued toward the operations building as if she hadn't heard a word. In reality, she heard everything. Years in uniform had taught her that people often revealed more about themselves than they intended, especially when they thought nobody important was listening. Inside the base, preparations for the next day's patrol were already underway. Maps covered tables. Radios crackled with updates. Officers moved between briefing rooms, while mechanics worked on vehicles outside. Abigail placed her rifle case against a wall and quietly reviewed mission notes. She spoke only when necessary. She asked precise questions. She took careful notes. The soldiers around her noticed the silence and mistook it for uncertainty. They noticed her calmness and mistook it for inexperience. One lieutenant glanced at her credentials before raising an eyebrow. "You don't say much, do you?" Abigail looked up from the map. "Only when I have something useful to say." The answer earned a few smirks from nearby troops. But one man didn't smile. A senior SEAL chief, standing near the doorway, watched the exchange without saying a word. He had served long enough to recognize a dangerous mistake when he saw one. As Abigail returned her attention to the mission briefing, the chief slowly shook his head. The soldiers laughing around the room thought they were looking at an outsider. What they didn't realize was that before the next sunset, every one of them would remember her name. The afternoon passed slowly across the mountains. Heat shimmered above the rocky slopes while distant ridgelines faded into a blue haze. Abigail Foster remained perfectly still behind her observation position, studying the terrain through optics that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. Most people imagine patience as something passive. They imagine waiting. Abigail knew better. Patience was work. It was constant observation, constant analysis, constant awareness. Every shadow, every movement, every change in the landscape. Hours earlier, the convoy had disappeared beyond the southern ridge. Since then, radio traffic had remained routine. Position updates, navigation checks, logistics reports. Nothing unusual. Yet the uneasy feeling that had settled in Abigail's mind refused to leave. She reviewed the terrain again. The patrol route crossed several narrow valleys before reaching a remote communications site scheduled for inspection. On paper, the route looked straightforward. In reality, the surrounding mountains created dozens of observation points overlooking the road. Most soldiers saw empty wilderness. Abigail saw lines of sight, elevation advantages, hidden approaches. She reached for her notebook and made several quiet observations. Wind conditions had shifted twice since noon. Visibility remained excellent. Temperatures were gradually dropping. Small details. Important details. The radio suddenly crackled. A routine position update came from the convoy commander. His voice sounded confident, relaxed. The patrol was ahead of schedule. Several soldiers back at the base would later remember hearing that transmission. It sounded ordinary, completely ordinary. Abigail listened carefully. Then she looked toward a distant ridgeline nearly 2 miles away. Something had changed. She could not immediately identify it, only that something felt different. She adjusted her optics and scanned the area again. A cluster of rocks set near the crest of the ridge. Beyond them stretched hundreds of yards of open terrain. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet her attention remained fixed there. Years of experience had taught her to trust instinct after observation, never before it. Instinct alone was dangerous. Instinct supported by evidence was valuable. Several minutes later, she noticed it. A brief flash, barely visible, gone almost immediately. Someone else might have dismissed it as sunlight reflecting from stone. Abigail did not. She continued watching. Another flash appeared several hundred yards farther along the ridge. Then another. Her expression never changed, but her focus sharpened. She keyed her radio. "Griffin Command, this is Overwatch 1. The Operations Center answered immediately. "Go ahead, Overwatch 1. Recommend increased monitoring of Ridge Sector 7. There was a short pause. Reason? Abigail continued studying the distant terrain. No confirmation yet. Just a recommendation. The duty officer acknowledged the report, though his tone suggested uncertainty. Abigail understood. Recommendations without explanations rarely impressed anyone. Still, she trusted what she was seeing. Nearly 40 minutes later, the convoy reached the communications site. Personnel began conducting inspections while vehicles established security positions. Everything proceeded according to plan. Some of the same soldiers who had mocked Abigail the previous day joked with one another over the radio. One voice even joked that the mountains were so quiet they could probably take a nap. Laughter followed. Abigail heard every word. She said nothing. Then another transmission arrived. This one sounded different. Shorter. More urgent. The relaxed tone that had filled the air all day vanished instantly. Inside the operations center at Forward Operating Base Griffin, officers straightened in their chairs. Radio operators exchanged concerned glances. Across the mountains, Abigail lowered her notebook and focused completely on the valley below. The feeling she had carried since morning was no longer a feeling. It was certainty. Something important was about to happen. And for the first time all day, the voices that had dismissed her were about to discover how much she had already seen. The radio traffic changed so subtly that most people would not have noticed it. Abigail Foster noticed immediately. Calm voices became shorter. Routine updates became questions. Questions became requests for clarification. From her position high above the valley, she continued scanning the terrain while information slowly assembled itself into a larger picture. The Convoy Commander checked in again. His voice remained professional, but the confidence from earlier had faded. Several vehicles had reported unusual activity along distant ridgelines. Nothing specific, nothing confirmed, just enough uncertainty to make experienced personnel pay attention. Back at Forward Operating Base Griffin, the operations center grew noticeably quieter. Screens displayed position data while analysts reviewed incoming reports. The duty officer who had politely questioned Abigail's earlier recommendation now found himself looking repeatedly toward Ridge Sector 7. What had seemed like a vague concern only an hour ago suddenly appeared much more relevant. Abigail adjusted her optics and studied the same ridgeline she had been watching all afternoon. The flashes she had observed earlier were gone. That did not reassure her. In many situations, the absence of activity could be more significant than activity itself. Beside her, a light breeze carried dust across the rocks. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western mountains, creating longer shadows across the valley floor. Visibility remained excellent, but conditions were changing. Every experienced observer understood how quickly a landscape could transform during the final hours of daylight. Another transmission arrived from the convoy. This time the voice belonged to one of the younger soldiers. Abigail immediately recognized him as one of the men who had laughed at her during equipment preparations the previous day. The difference in his tone was impossible to miss. The casual confidence was gone. In its place was caution, careful attention, respect for uncertainty. He was learning a lesson that military service often taught sooner or later. The environment did not care about assumptions. The mountains did not care about opinions. Reality eventually revealed itself to everyone. Abigail continued monitoring multiple sectors at once. Distances, angles, routes, observation points. Her notebook now contained pages of small details collected throughout the day. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern. She keyed her radio again. Griffin Command, Overwatch 1. Go ahead. Recommend convoy limit movement through the northern approach corridor. This time nobody questioned her recommendation. Copy that. Overwatch 1. The response came instantly. Several officers inside the operations center exchanged looks. The change was subtle but important. Earlier, her assessments had been treated as suggestions. Now they were treated as expertise. The convoy adjusted course. Vehicles slowed. Personnel increased observation of surrounding terrain. Across the valley, Abigail watched the changes unfold exactly as expected. Yet she remained unsatisfied. Something still felt incomplete. She studied the landscape again. Then she saw it. Not a flash. Not movement. A pattern. Several distant features that appeared unrelated at first glance suddenly aligned in her mind. Roads. Elevation. Observation angles. The realization caused her eyes to narrow slightly. She reached for her radio one more time. Her voice remained calm, steady, controlled. But every person listening could hear the certainty behind it now. Griffin Command, she said quietly. I think I know what we are looking at. Inside the operations center, every conversation stopped. The duty officer leaned toward the radio. Go ahead, Overwatch 1. Abigail Foster kept her eyes on the distant terrain. The pieces finally fit together. The ridgelines, the observation angles, the unusual flashes, the movement reports. None of them meant much individually. Together they revealed something entirely different. The northern corridor is not the objective, she said calmly. It is the distraction. Silence followed. Several officers exchanged confused looks. The convoy commander immediately responded over the radio. Explain. Abigail traced the route with her finger across a map positioned beside her observation equipment. All terrain indicators point toward the Western Valley approach. Anyone monitoring our movement would expect us to focus on the northern ridges. That leaves the western corridor largely ignored. The operations officer studied incoming reports. The more he compared them to Abigail's assessment, the more her conclusion made sense. You think someone wants attention directed away from the western approach? He asked. I do. The convoy commander acknowledged the warning. Patrol leaders began reviewing their positions, while vehicle crews increased observation toward the west. For several minutes, nothing happened. The mountains remained quiet. The roads remained empty. A younger officer inside the command center shifted uncomfortably. He had heard stories about experienced operators becoming overly cautious. He wondered if perhaps everyone was overreacting. Then a transmission arrived from one of the patrol vehicles. The tone of the speaker changed everything. Command, this is Patrol 3. We have unusual activity near the Western Valley. Every person in the operations center looked up. Abigail closed her eyes briefly. Not from relief. From confirmation. The pattern had been correct. Additional reports followed within moments. Personnel throughout the patrol began observing details that had previously gone unnoticed. Changes in the environment. Unusual positioning. Indicators that something was developing beyond routine activity. The convoy commander immediately ordered increased coordination between units. The atmosphere shifted. Earlier that day, conversations had been relaxed. Now every voice carried purpose. Every instruction mattered. Abigail continued monitoring from her elevated position. The same soldiers who had laughed at her less than 24 hours earlier were now asking for updates through shared communications channels. They did not know it yet, but many of their decisions were already being shaped by her observations. The senior SEAL chief stood inside the operations center with his arms folded. He listened quietly as reports flowed across multiple channels. One young soldier finally looked toward him. Chief, did you know she was this good? The older man allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. I knew enough not to underestimate her. Across the mountains, daylight continued fading. Long shadows stretched across the valley floor. Visibility slowly decreased as evening approached. Abigail checked wind conditions again and updated her calculations. Her movements remained steady and methodical. No wasted motion. No unnecessary words. The convoy commander came across the radio once more. This time his voice sounded different than it had that morning. There was no trace of skepticism. No trace of casual confidence. Only professional respect. Overwatch 1. We are adjusting our route based on your recommendations. Abigail nodded even though nobody could see her. Understood. A brief pause followed. Then the commander added something nobody would have expected to hear 24 hours earlier. Good catch. Abigail returned her attention to the mountains. The situation was far from over. In fact, she suspected it was only beginning. But somewhere inside the convoy, several soldiers were finally learning a lesson that would stay with them long after the mission ended. The quietest person in the room is not always the least capable. Sometimes they are simply the one who sees the most. Twilight settled across the mountains as the convoy continued moving under revised instructions. The temperature dropped steadily, and the golden light of late afternoon faded into cool shades of blue and gray. From her observation position, Abigail Foster watched the valley transform. Features that had been obvious an hour earlier now blended into the landscape. Distances became harder to judge. Shadows concealed details. For most people, visibility was decreasing. For Abigail, the changing conditions simply required a different kind of attention. She adjusted her optics and reviewed every sector once again. The western corridor remained her primary concern. Reports from the convoy continued arriving at regular intervals. Each update added another piece to the picture forming in her mind. The patrol had successfully avoided several areas that now appeared increasingly questionable. More importantly, they remained organized, calm, disciplined. Inside the operations center, confidence in Abigail's assessments continued to grow. Officers who had never met her before were now requesting her observations before making route decisions. The change happened gradually enough that few people noticed it. Earlier, she had been the quiet specialist operating from a remote position. Now she had become one of the most trusted voices in the mission. The irony was not lost on the senior SEAL chief. He remembered the comments from the previous morning. The laughter, the assumptions, the certainty that some of the younger soldiers had displayed when judging someone they did not know. Experience had taught him that competence rarely announces itself. It simply reveals itself over time. Far below, one of the younger infantry soldiers keyed his radio. Abigail immediately recognized his voice. He was the same soldier who had joked about her studying maps like homework. Overwatch 1. This is Patrol 3. Go ahead. A brief pause followed. Just wanted to say your recommendation probably saved us a lot of trouble today. Several other voices could be heard in the background. Nobody laughed this time. Abigail glanced toward the darkening horizon. Just doing my job. The soldier hesitated before answering. Still, thank you. The transmission ended. Abigail returned to her observations. The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds, but it spoke volumes. Respect had begun replacing assumptions. Not because of rank, not because of reputation, because of results. As darkness continued approaching, another weather update arrived from the base. Conditions were expected to become more challenging during the evening hours. Wind patterns were shifting again. Visibility would continue decreasing. Abigail carefully updated her notes and calculations. She noticed several subtle changes across the terrain and immediately passed the information along to the convoy commander. Within minutes, adjustments were made. Once again, her recommendations proved valuable. The convoy remained on schedule while avoiding unnecessary risk. Back at Forward Operating Base Griffin, personnel began preparing for the patrol's eventual return. Yet nobody was relaxing. Everyone understood the mission was not finished. Abigail understood it better than anyone. She looked across miles of mountains disappearing into darkness and felt the same certainty she had carried all day. The most important moment of the mission had not happened yet. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, beyond the fading light and deepening shadows, a final test still waited. And when it arrived, every person listening to her voice on the radio would discover exactly why she had earned the position she held. Darkness settled fully across the mountains. The last traces of sunlight disappeared behind distant ridgelines, leaving only moonlight and scattered starlight to define the rugged terrain. Abigail Foster remained exactly where she had been for hours. Her focus never drifted. Her posture never relaxed. The world around her had grown quiet, but experience told her that quiet moments often carried the greatest importance. The convoy was now entering the final phase of its return route. Communications remained steady. Vehicle positions were accounted for. Team leaders checked in at regular intervals. Everything appeared under control. Yet Abigail continued studying the landscape with the same intensity she had. shown since dawn. The younger soldiers had begun to understand something that military veterans learned through years of service. Success often came from preparation long before a problem appeared. It came from noticing details that others overlooked. A transmission suddenly broke the routine flow of radio traffic. One of the patrol vehicles reported an unexpected obstacle along a narrow section of road. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, just enough to force the convoy to slow down and reconsider its movement plan. The convoy commander immediately requested recommendations. Several officers inside the operations center began reviewing maps and route options. Before anyone could offer a solution, Abigail was already speaking. Take the eastern bypass. The commander paused. That route adds nearly 20 minutes. It does, Abigail replied. But it gives you better visibility and more room to maneuver. There was a brief silence. 24 hours earlier, the recommendation might have triggered debate. Now nobody argued. Understood, the commander answered. Eastern bypass it is. The convoy adjusted course. Inside the operations center, the senior SEAL chief watched the reaction among the staff. Nobody questioned the decision. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody laughed. The same people who had dismissed Abigail's observations were now trusting them without hesitation. Respect had arrived quietly, not through speeches or introductions, through competence. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Reports continued arriving from the convoy. The eastern route proved smoother than expected. Visibility improved exactly as Abigail predicted. Progress resumed. Tension gradually eased. One young specialist who had spent most of the day listening finally shook his head in disbelief. How does she keep seeing things before everyone else? The chief looked toward the operations map. Because she spends more time observing than talking. Far above the valley, Abigail allowed herself a small sip of water before returning her attention to the terrain. Her work was not finished simply because things were going well. Complacency had ended more careers than failure ever could. Nearly an hour later, the convoy commander checked in again. This time there was something different in his voice. Genuine admiration. Overwatch 1. Convoy is approaching the final checkpoint. Abigail nodded. Copy. I think every person out here owes you a thank you. She looked across the dark mountains stretching for miles beyond the horizon. Just get everyone home. The transmission ended. Around her, the mountains remained silent. Yet somewhere below, soldiers who had once measured her by appearance now measured her by performance. And in their minds, the difference between those two judgments could not have been larger. The convoy was less than an hour from forward operating base Griffin when the final challenge appeared. It arrived without warning, hidden inside what initially looked like an ordinary navigation problem. A vehicle near the front reported conflicting route data between two mapping systems. Under normal circumstances, the issue would have been minor. Tonight, after a long day of constant adjustments, it threatened to slow the entire convoy at exactly the wrong moment. The commander immediately requested updated guidance. Several personnel inside the operations center began comparing maps, satellite images, and previous route records. Different answers emerged from different sources. Confusion spread. Minutes passed. The convoy slowed further. Out in the mountains, darkness continued deepening. Abigail Foster listened quietly as multiple voices debated the best course of action. Then she studied the terrain one more time. The answer revealed itself almost immediately. Earlier in the day, she had spent hours observing areas that nobody else considered important. She remembered every ridgeline, every valley entrance, every elevation change. What appeared complicated on a digital map looked completely different through the eyes of someone who had watched the landscape all day. She keyed her radio. Use Route Echo. The operations officer hesitated. Route Echo is not the primary return route. No, Abigail replied. But it is the correct one. Silence followed. The convoy commander trusted her enough not to argue. Convoy copies. Route. Echo. Vehicles adjusted course once again. Several minutes later, the reports started coming in. Visibility improved. Navigation became simpler. Travel speed increased. The problem disappeared almost immediately. Inside the operations center, one young lieutenant stared at the map in disbelief. How did she know that? Nobody answered. Because nobody had a simple explanation. The truth was more complicated. Abigail knew because she had spent the entire day paying attention when everyone else was focused on something else. Excellence rarely looked dramatic in the moment. It usually looked like preparation. The convoy continued moving steadily toward base. Tension gradually faded from every radio transmission. Voices sounded lighter. Conversations returned. For the first time all day, people began believing the mission would conclude without further complications. The commander finally checked in again. Overwatch 1. Convoy is entering the final approach corridor. Abigail looked toward the distant lights of the base barely visible on the horizon. Copy. Another pause followed. Then a different voice came across the radio. One of the infantry soldiers who had laughed at her on her first day. Chief Foster. Abigail recognized him immediately. Go ahead. The young man hesitated. I owe you an apology. Several nearby radios fell silent. Nobody interrupted. I thought I had you figured out when you arrived. Abigail listened without speaking. Turns out I did not know anything at all. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. It happens. The soldier laughed nervously. Not going to make that mistake again. When the transmission ended, Abigail returned her attention to the mountains one final time. The mission had demanded patience, judgment, and discipline. More importantly, it had revealed something to everyone involved. The people who speak the least are not always the ones with the least to offer. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the right moment to prove what they already know. The convoy rolled through the gates of forward operating base Griffin shortly after midnight. Headlights swept across the compound as vehicles returned to their designated positions, and exhausted soldiers finally stepped onto familiar ground. Conversations filled the cool night air. Some people headed toward the operations center. Others moved toward the dining facility in search of coffee and a late meal. For the first time in nearly 20 hours, the mission was officially complete. Inside the operations center, officers gathered for a final review. Maps remained spread across tables. Reports continued arriving. What had begun as a routine patrol had become something very different. Again and again, the discussion returned to the same name. Abigail Foster. One officer pointed to a timeline displayed on a monitor. Every major adjustment that had improved the convoy's progress traced back to her observations. Another officer highlighted route changes that prevented delays. A third reviewed communications logs showing how her recommendations consistently proved accurate. The evidence spoke for itself. No exaggeration was necessary. Across the room, the senior SEAL chief listened quietly. He had witnessed countless missions throughout his career. Some were remembered for dramatic moments. Others were remembered because someone made the right decisions before problems appeared. This mission belonged to the second category. Meanwhile, Abigail sat alone outside the operations building, cleaning her equipment beneath a dim security light. Her routine never changed. Mission complete. Equipment checked. Notes reviewed. Lessons recorded. She worked with the same focus she had shown all day. A group of soldiers approached from across the compound. Abigail recognized them immediately. They were the same young men who had joked about her on her first morning at the base. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt uncomfortable. Finally, one of them stepped forward. Chief Foster. Abigail looked up. Yeah. The young soldier shifted awkwardly. We wanted to thank you. Another soldier nodded. And apologize. Abigail waited. We made assumptions. The first soldier glanced toward the ground before continuing. We thought we knew exactly who you were the moment we saw you. A faint smile appeared on Abigail's face. That usually says more about the person making the assumption than the person being judged. Several soldiers laughed softly. Not because the comment was funny, because it was true. One of them shook his head. I do not think any of us will forget today. Abigail closed her notebook and stood. Good. Good, he repeated. That means you learned something. The soldiers exchanged thoughtful looks. They had expected a lecture. They had expected criticism. Instead, they received something far more valuable. Perspective. As Abigail picked up her gear and started walking toward the barracks, one of the younger soldiers called after her. Chief. She stopped. What is it? How do you get that good? Abigail considered the question for a moment. Then she answered with the same simplicity that defined everything she did. Pay attention when everyone else is busy talking. She continued walking into the darkness. Behind her, the soldiers stood silently watching her leave. The mission was over. The reports would eventually be filed away. The details would fade with time. But the lesson would remain. Respect is not earned through appearances. It is earned through character, discipline, and the quiet confidence to let actions speak louder than words.